sale now, friends. What you got to understand is that those little blips of inclusiveness and education that we thought we were going to get in the 60s and thereafter, that stuff's going down the tubes now. There are fewer minority people in colleges and universities now than there were some few years ago. And more and more people are not having scholarship aid to go to college. The thing about it is, though, we got to watch that, because the magician in you ought to be blessed too. You got a 2-million-year-old mind, and every truck driver has got a 2-million-year-old mind. And it's part of this. It's a part of this classist curse that so many wonderful young men of color and Caucasians believe that they are stupid and that they don't have any right to becoming educated and participating in the riches of the human past. And listen, this is burgeoning now. Pretty soon, if we don't change something, pretty soon we're going to see the establishment of a radically classist culture that is much worse than it is right now. We're moving toward a world in which there's not going to be a middle class. There's going to be a very rich elite that lives in fortified enclaves. It is an ugly reality that's developed. The community deteriorates, and what happens to our selfhood, our cohesiveness of our human selves? They fragment worse. That's a rule. You can take that to the bank. The less participation in community and significant relationships you've got, it doesn't matter how much therapy you've ever had. It doesn't matter how good your childhood was. If you have not got an adequate self-object milieu, that's the $150 word. All that means is you don't have a community. That is to say, you do not have people that affirm your selfhood and who are at your shoulder and at your back when you're in a crisis. So here you are. Put yourself in the place of these young fathers, these young mothers. No extended family, they're in some other city. The needs of the children are so enormous. And then the need of the child in me and the need of the child in my wife is so enormous. And they're trying to parent. Indigenous peoples knew better than that. They knew you couldn't raise children with a nuclear couple like that. And so this is what you're getting at. We've got to face up to this. We've got to be in the business of community building. And the reason I say men is because we have been the ones that have really imbibed a lot of this Lone Ranger mythology. And see if we are up to stretching our minds around the idea that all this election crap, all this talk, is a result of splitting. It's a result of a failure in the cohesiveness of our selfhood. It is the idea that the world is a zero-sum game. If I win, you must lose. And what I want us to get a sense for is the psychological wound which underlies all of this. And I want to loop this back to another kind of mythology which we also see, which is, I believe, just as old, if not older, than the twins mythology. And it is the mythology of the abandoned children that you see coming up in Robert often tells the story of Hansel and Gretel. Now, you see this coming up again in Star Wars. The abandoned twins. See? I'm going to suggest to you that the experience of abandonment precedes the experience of this splitting. Because in those abandonment stories, in Hansel and Gretel don't hate each other. There's these royal children, a prince and a princess, and they are born into the world, and they are supposed to receive the kingdom. And something happens. Here's the mystery of iniquity, see? Mystery of evil. Something happens. And in different stories, it's a different happening. But something happens, and what happens is that these twins are cast into exile where they are no longer recognized as royal. And so these most precious children are born into the world in a royal household, and they, because of something that's not their fault, something that's the very important piece there, something that is not their fault, they are exiled. And they are raised by a woodsman in his family, or a fisherman in his family, or a herdsman in his family. And until many years later, they are not recognized as who they are. And later on in these myths, they are often restored to the rightful inheritance. The point is that before the rage and the splitting, where there's a good one and a bad one, there's a prior abandonment. A lot of our abandonment is pre-verbal. We've all got this mythology of there was a time when it wasn't all shit. But the psychoanalytic studies are showing us that a great deal of that stuff occurs before you have speech, before you have language. What many of the I think more creative psychoanalytic thinkers have been talking about is, as Michael Balint says, there's a basic fault. What's that? That's earlier than speech. You can't remember that, and so you can't speak it. But this stuff's in your body. You got a lot of rage and pain and grief in your body that can't get through the computers up here to get put into words. And it's an experience of being not touched when you needed to be touched, not held when you needed to be held. It's experiences of looking up in your cradle and seeing disgusted eyes. The experience of circumcision. So when I started getting into this in my analysis, starting kind of get back, trying to get my feelings around what it must have been like for me as an infant, then some stories that I had been told came back about the fact that I could not hold any food when I was very, very, very small. Right after I was born, they called it colic in those days in the South. And if it hadn't been for my father, who got me in one of those old Chevy cars, you know, and drove me 100 and something miles over to Memphis to a doctor who had some wisdom about dealing with colicky little boys, I'd be dead. Dehydration. But what it was is my mother could not stand all this shit and anxiety, see. And see, that is the kind of, and I haven't healed that, and I don't think I probably ever will. And so the first seed of rage comes out of that early experience of there not being enough. Robert talks a lot lately about the greed in our culture and the rapacious hunger. Michael Mead tells the story of the cannibal king. Eats his people, eats everybody, finally eats himself. You know. Well, this is the territory you're talking about there, this sense of scarcity, and we got to ask a question. You got to ask it for your own life. Where is this coming from? See, what is this sense of scarcity? What is this sense that we've got to make sure that minorities don't get any progress because there's not enough to go around, etc., etc. Because it's all related to this mythology and the human experience that underlies it. So now, where does this leave us? We're left with this situation in which we experience an abundance of curses and a scarcity of blessing. If anything, indigenous peoples were much, much better about the sense of blessing than people in the history of the modern West. If you look at the recent history in the West, it is a history of an experienced declining supply of blessings. And Robert talks about a movement now that we see toward more and more of a sibling society. And that's another way of sibling, rather than having any parents around to bless. Nobody's around to bless. That's true. This is what is happening all around the world. More and more elders are being disempowered, and the more and more tribal elders and indigenous elders are disempowered, the less blessing there will be around. And the more and more fathers are marginalized and disempowered, the less and less blessing there will be around. So we see a long history here. It's a long, tragic. It's a tragic history, and the thing is, our denial is so massive. If it were just a historical problem, that would be one thing. But what we have to realize is that this big snake of rage isn't just back there. And he isn't just out there. What we've got to realize is we have this great snake inside us. And it is a snake that is so enraged because he's never been seen. And when he was ever seen, he was cursed and not blessed. And each one of us men here were cursed in a little different pattern. A little different snowflake of curses, you know? But each one of us has this shadow brother who is inside, who carries an enormous amount of our gold. And so this is the situation, and the situation is such, it gets worse. That is to say, this stuff is cumulative. Tribal peoples always knew that hatred was contagious. They always knew that it just sort of permeated things and would contaminate the entire group if you didn't address it. And a lot of the ritual that we had in indigenous cultures was to help us deal with our experiences of being cursed and to try to get back into the blessing way and to facing this split and to facing the way in which culture has sanctified this split and religion has sanctified this split. Today, I just want us to stay with our sense of the awfulness of this, our history.